Elites these days, youth these days, how about saints these days? What does it look like to draw close to Jesus and live as Catholics in our increasingly complex, confusing world? We're Susanna and Krysanne, promising no cliches, just honest conversations, personal stories, and insights into issues that affect us as modern Indian Catholics. Welcome to Saints These Days. So welcome back to Saints These Days. In our last episode, I shared a bit about my story and how God moved me from a place of judgment and harshness to a place of compassion and holy balance. In this episode, we're going to hear from Krysanne Martis. A lot of you have already heard her story, which she's shared openly over the past 2 years. But for those who haven't, Krysanne's going to share in brief her conversion story. But don't run away in case you've heard it before, because this time we're going to ask her some questions that no one's asked her before, and little insights into behind the scenes, what it really means, what it's been like to share her story publicly. So Krysanne, go ahead and share with us. Tell us, what is your story? Where were you and where are you now? What has God done for you?
So, Susanna, I think that I am one of the few, or maybe the many people who, I just got really lost when I was younger. I grew up Catholic. I was baptized Catholic. I was excited about being Catholic when I was younger. But as I grew older, kind of the voices of the world became really loud. I spent a lot of time on social media, and I began kind of seeing my faith as at odds with these ideas that, the world is presenting to me. And one of the biggest things was to do with the whole LGBT thing. So I figured out from a very young age that I was attracted to women. I experienced attraction to other women. And I knew that this was weird, different, not a normal experience. And because of my time on social media, I also kind of realized that the church has an issue with my attraction, with my sexual orientation, I guess. And so pretty early on, this introduced a kind of distance or a disconnect between me and my faith. And as I grew older, I really began believing that there was nothing wrong with acting on the same-sex attraction, with I was in a relationship with a girl for quite a while, for a year about. And I really didn't think there was anything wrong with what I was doing. I also kind of developed, I guess you could call it a very relaxed attitude about my body and my sexuality. And so when I was in college, I was in a lot of impure relationships, and I really did not think there was anything wrong with what I was doing. And so that's kind of a snapshot, which I feel there's a lot of people, there's a lot of Catholics who kind of go through this phase of just kind of really questioning, especially in the area of sexuality, why the church teaches what she teaches. And that was me. I was very much I didn't get, I was okay with God. I was okay with Jesus. I just felt the rules of the church were a bit too much for me. And so I decided I was not gonna subscribe to them. It was just not my cup of tea.
So what changed, Krysanne? Obviously you were not the good Catholic girl for a while, and that's not at all uncommon, I would think. I mean, whether it's the LGBT issues or something else, but a lot of people started off with being good Catholic kids and then said wait, does this even make sense, and is this really how I want to live my life? But you obviously are now a super enthu Catholic. So what changed? What happened?
Okay, so what happened is that I attended this Catholic conference in the middle of lockdown, which was super unlike me. The only reason I did it is because I needed to fix my sleep schedule, and the conference would start early in the morning online. And so I was cool, I will attend this. I will fix my sleep schedule and nothing else will change. Boy, was I wrong. So I attended this conference, and the speaker in one of the sessions, he narrated the story of Saint Paul. Now, if you don't know this story, have you been living under a rock? No, I'm kidding, because I'd never heard this story before. But basically, Saint Paul was a persecutor of Christians before his personal conversion. So he would go from place to place persecuting the early Christians because he believed that they were leading the Jews away from the true faith. And so this was who he was before he encountered Jesus. And so he was traveling to Damascus when he encountered the risen Lord. And from that point onwards, he became so convinced that Jesus was truly the Son of God that he became one of the greatest apostles. He became the Apostle St. Paul. And when I heard the story, I was so shocked because the way that I was living my life up until that point, I guess I genuinely thought that even if God wanted me back, or even if I wanted to go back to God, he wouldn't have me because I had, made all these mistakes. Like you said, I was not that good Catholic girl. I had made so many mistakes that I knew that, he probably would not take me back. And, I guess like if you ask me, I never wanted to go back, but like, I felt like that it wasn't an option anymore. And hearing the story of St. Paul, I guess I realized that God, like, he would forgive me because he forgave Paul. Paul persecuted Christians, me, never persecuted a Christian in my life. So I probably would make the cut and he would take me back. And kind of realizing that that was an option, something inside of me was just like, I want that. I want to go back. And that was like, I call it my road to Damascus moment of just the first time in my life where I was really open to, reconnecting with my faith and like, getting in touch with God again.
So let me ask you something. While you were going through your LGBT years and you were experiencing all of these attractions, you were going through different relationships, how did you see God? Like, who was God to you at that point?
I guess I always saw him as this guy in the sky who was looking down on me, and he was like pretty like happy, pretty chill.
Was he a white guy?
He was a white guy.
Did he have a white beard?
He did have a white beard.
I
so
knew
yeah,
it.
super stereotypical, like, big guy in the sky, occasionally giving me the thumbs up, just like everything's all cool with him, just love each other and everything is fine.
Kind of like a hippie guy, huh?
Yeah, he was hippie.
So if this hippie cool God guy in the sky was cool with everything, how does it make sense? Like, I don't understand. Why did you think that you needed to be forgiven if he was cool with everything you were doing?
That's a really good question. It's something that I have been trying to figure out myself over the past few years, is that, if I really thought that God was okay with everything I was doing, then why did I feel that need for forgiveness? And I guess, so there's two parts to it. So one part is what I can say right now, which is that St. Paul tells us in the New Testament, he tells us that God's law is written on our hearts. And so even if we can think and we can rationalize our bad behavior, inside of us, there is a small voice called a conscience, which will always convict us when we do something wrong. And I believe that, inside of me, somewhere deep, deep down inside of me, again, below all of the rationalization and the reasons and everything, I still knew that I was doing something wrong and something needed to change. So I guess that's one answer. And the other answer is that, in that moment, I wouldn't say so much that I needed forgiveness, but more like I felt like I needed to go home. Like kind of seeing how God was so willing to take Paul back. That really meant, it told me something about his love. His love is so unconditional that here's this guy who's literally trying to tear down his church, and God was still willing to take him back. And I guess for me, like, that gave me an image of love and of like, just this place that I could run home to, that the moment I heard about it, I wanted that, because I guess I had just been like wandering around for all this time. I'd been trying to like, figure things out for myself, trying to look for that love, that unconditional love that I wanted in all kinds of different places. And nothing was satisfying me. And I guess I also reached this point of like, okay, fine, nothing will ever satisfy me. There's nothing in this world that can satisfy this deep, deep hunger for love that I have inside of me. And C.S. Lewis said this: if there's nothing in this world that can, satisfy me, that means I'm made for something out of this world. And that's what I realized, is that, oh, God can love in that way. And so I want that. And it was really like this homecoming of like, I have been wandering around for so long. Everything I try just feels a little off. Anyone who has traveled abroad knows what I'm talking about. It's like, yeah, it's kind of good. And, it's not bad. I don't hate it here. But if I could just go home, then everything would be okay again. And that's what I felt. That, it wasn't so much like, forgiveness, guilt. These are all clinical terms. But it was really just a homecoming for me.
That's so beautiful, Krysanne. That sort of makes me think about this time when I was struggling with something. I had been hoping that something would work out with a guy that I was interested in. And it didn't work out. And I was just really disappointed and sad. And I remember going home to my parents. And I'm very close with my parents. And I share with them like about everything. So I remember going home and just sitting in their bedroom and like telling them like, well, this is not happening. And it was really beautiful because I remember they didn't give me any advice. They didn't like tell me, oh, you should have done this, or, stop, bothering about these things, or it'll get better. They just sat with me and like they let me cry. My mom held my hand and then they prayed for me. And I just remember, this very safe feeling of like, okay, like, yeah, I'm home. Like, I'm safe, I'm okay. Things are not perfect, but I'm okay. And yeah, it sounds a bit like that's what you were experiencing, or that's what you do experience with God as your home.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And precisely what you said, Susanna, things are not perfect. I don't want, people listening to this to think like, oh, now, like, your life is perfect and you've found the answer to all of your questions and everything's just like fine now. It's really not. In fact, like, it's hard. Life is hard. It never gets easy. Sometimes it gets easy and then it gets hard again, and like last year, for example, is one of the most painful and the most difficult years that I've ever had. I think like a lot of disappointments, a lot of confusion and not knowing what was happening. But throughout that, I just knew one thing, which is that God was in control and that he was fighting for me, and I did not need to figure everything out on my own. So it's exactly what you just said about like, going home and knowing that there's someone in your corner. You're not alone. You don't have to figure things out on your own. Things are not perfect, but you are home and things will be okay. And that's exactly what it was like to come home to God.
That's so beautiful. I just love that image of God as a home. I don't think I've exactly heard that before. I've heard of people talk of the church as a home, God as a refuge, but like just the word like God is our home, right? God is our home. And when we're not at home, like, yeah, there's this restlessness, there's this feeling of disorientation.
So I want to say one more thing about, this conversion story that I'm sharing, which is that I feel like there were two parts to it. So the first part of it is what I just shared, which is like, I heard the story of St. Paul. I knew that I could go home, and so I wanted to go home. And the second part of it, I hadn't taken out my brain and put it in a box. Like, I still had all of these questions. I still had all of these things that I was wrestling with the church. And so on some level, on the very basic, very deep, and I feel the most important level, I knew that God loved me and that he was in my corner. And so I feel like the most important question was answered. Can I be loved? Yes, I'm already perfectly loved by a God who is love. And there's nothing I can do to lose his love. He's always going to love me no matter what. But then the second level to that, like, a little higher level, is just that, what do I do with this same-sex attraction? What do I do with my desires? What do I do with like all of these questions that I have, this, wrestling with the church's teachings? What do I do about that? And I was so blessed that my friend and my mentor at the time, who I was sharing very openly with all of these things that were happening inside of me, these questions that I still had, she recommended that I read Theology of the Body, which is, it's a series of speeches or essays by Pope St. John Paul II. But it was way too dense for me to read. And so what I did was I read the Introduction to Theology of the Body by Christopher West. And I read that book. It basically told me what God's plan was for our bodies and our sexuality when he created us. And I read that book and literally, honestly, I had no further questions. Like, it clarified things for me. It introduced me to this like tapestry of reason. And I realized that the teachings of the church were not arbitrary rules, as I thought they were my entire life, but they were all interconnected to make so much of sense and reveal this beautiful, deep beauty that is etched into our bodies through our sexuality. And after I read that, I guess like that was my head conversion. So initially I had this heart conversion of like, God does love me and he will take me back no matter what. And then I had this head conversion of, oh, now I know the reasons and now I'm okay with it. Like I no longer need to wrestle with these teachings, these particular teachings of the church, and I can, stay home. Like this is a good place for me to be. I want to be here. So that's kind of like the second part of my conversion.
That's beautiful. I feel like for a lot of people, it probably works that way, right? It's like first our hearts, then our heads, because we're not even willing to like engage intellectually unless, our hearts are actually open. So that's really cool that you were able to see that happening in your life and see God working first, through your heart and then through your mind. So Krysanne, I want to now move on to a little bit about you sharing your story and ask some of the questions perhaps that others haven't asked you. So the big question, right? In India, we tend to be a kind of private type of people, right? I feel like people don't generally prefer to share stuff that's going on inside with the outside world. So, what made you decide to share such a personal story publicly?
So I feel like it was two reasons. And the first reason is that when I was living my before life, I was super public about it. I went for pride parades. On my social media, I would share love is love and how can love be wrong? And I was very vocal about that stuff. And after I had this conversion, I wasn't really active on social media for some time while I was kind of figuring out all of these things internally. And I guess at some point, I was just like, I want to set the record straight in a way. I want people to know that I'm not the same person I used to be, because I had said all of these things in the past. I didn't want them to think that I still believe them. And the second reason, I guess, is I had discovered this thing which had changed my life. I had discovered Jesus and he changed my life. And I couldn't not tell people about it. I guess this is the type of person I am. Like, I'm so, like, you know, if I believe that this is going to help you, I need to tell you about it. If I read this really good book, you have to read this book too. And if I watch this movie, you need to watch this movie. It's so good. It's going to change your life. Jesus, I believed, could change everyone's life. He had come for everyone. And so I needed to tell people about him. I needed to tell people what he did for me and what he could do for them.
So it sounds a lot like that's kind of who you are anyway, right? You're somebody who likes to share. You're someone who's not really afraid to be upfront and to share openly and personally. And it kind of sounds like, you know, God's using all of that stuff, now for him and in his kingdom and to help people to know him. Kind of like St. Paul, right? Have you heard of that guy?
I think I might have. Once or twice.
Yeah, so St. Paul was also obviously a extremely zealous kind of guy, you know, going on like very proactively, like rooting out these terrible Christians. And then, you know, he had this amazing conversion and then he's like, okay, let's do this thing. And he becomes like the most famous evangelist of all time. So I guess God uses the stuff that he's already put in us, but just like aiming it in the right direction.
Yeah, I just feel like something I say a lot is that I feel like my passion and my zeal is just properly calibrated now. Like, it was always there. It was operating, I guess, on the wrong, the wrong frequency or whatever. And now I'm just like properly calibrated.
Right. So this is who you are. This is who God has created you to be someone who shares, someone who communicates. And I guess not everyone has to do it in the same way as you. Like, this is you. And I think it's beautiful that you said that yes to God and that you're just doing it. So I guess the big question, though, is this obviously is not the easiest choice to make. I mean, even though you did it, now looking back, what would you say are some of the pros and cons of sharing your testimony so publicly?
So there are a few cons. I'm going to start with the cons so I can end with the pros. But yeah, there are a few cons. And I guess the main con is that people see me differently now, even Catholics. So I guess, I remember when I shared my testimony the first time, my friends were quite upset, my college friends. One of my college friends was like, oh, you must be getting a lot of support from within your church, so you think you can say all of these things. And I was like, you know what, actually, I'm not getting that much of support from within the church, because I guess a lot of people don't really agree with this church teaching in particular, and they were not happy that I was sharing about it. So there was a lot of judging. I noticed people in church, some people just started avoiding me because they didn't want to talk to me. And I even had one time a guy who was interested in me. After I shared my testimony publicly, he was put off by that. I guess he just wasn't comfortable with the fact that I was so open about, my past, and he was just he just got put off.
What's crazy is that I feel like in most of India, people have a lot of stories they just won't share it. So it's it's just better if nobody knows. Just keep it all under wraps, which is so unhealthy.
Yeah, how is that better?
Right.
So kind of similar to that is, I guess, I need to constantly clarify that I am still attracted to men. I don't exclusively experience same-sex attraction. I'm afraid that there have been times when I've not clarified this. And so people think oh, I'm just this celibate for life type person. No, guys, I would love to get married. I believe that God is calling me to the vocation of marriage. I would love to have a family one day. And I feel like I need to constantly clarify this Because I guess like for two reasons. And one reason is that, yeah, I would love to get married. And I want like, people to know that I am an eligible spinster.
Please meet eligible Catholic spinster number 1, Krysanne Martis.
Thanks for the shout out. I need it. But also, I guess the second reason is that my cross is not as heavy as some other people. I don't exclusively experience attraction to the same sex, which means that I can still, God willing, be married one day. But there are a lot of Catholics for whom this struggle of same-sex attraction is, it's much more deep-seated. Maybe they exclusively experience same-sex attraction. And so their cross is significantly heavier than mine. I don't want to speak for them. I don't want people to think that, my struggle is as hard as theirs. So another con, a really big con, is that I lost a lot of my friends, like I mentioned earlier. I had a lot of friends who knew my identity, who knew my sexuality, and they were super, huge fans, very supportive, and also, I guess, subscribe to all of these liberal values. And when I shared my testimony publicly, they realized that I no longer agreed with these things that they supported. And for some people, it was overnight. For some people, it took a month. But basically, none of my college friends really talk to me anymore, except for one, whom I love. She's just a darling. But yeah, everyone else, they don't really talk to me anymore. A lot of them, said a lot of hurtful things to me before, blocking me. A couple of people were being so mean that I had to block them, which I did not like. But yeah, I was just these are people who I thought would be at my wedding one day. I love them so dearly. I wanted to be friends with them for the rest of my life.
That's so rough, Krysanne. That's that's a real cost, right, of sharing openly and of even having a conversion, I guess. And I know different people pay different prices, but that sounds really rough. That sounds really hard.
Okay, so just a couple more cons, then we're going to go to the pros. If you're getting depressed, guys, just bear with me for a little bit longer. Another thing is that telling my family was really awkward and uncomfortable. So I knew that I needed to talk to them about this before I shared my testimony publicly. I did not want them to find out from social media. And I'm talking about my immediate family. So I put it off for the longest time, but finally I told them about it. I told them about what I was going to say. I told them about my story. I told them that I was going to share it publicly. It was super awkward, uncomfortable, and really difficult. But I'm glad I did it. And I guess I'll talk about this later, the upside about it. But yeah, it just introduced this level of vulnerability into our relationship that was never there before, and that I genuinely thought we did not need. And so that was really uncomfortable. And the last, I guess, con of sharing my testimony online is that a lot of people now know things about me, know a lot of things about me before having ever met me. And so I guess you could say I have a reputation that precedes me, for good or for bad. And yeah, it's weird. I'm still getting used to it. 3 years down the line, I'll meet people and they'll say, "Oh, I've heard your testimony. I went on a date once." And the guy on the date was like, I have listened to your testimony. And I was like, I don't know what I feel about this. You now know all the vulnerable parts of my life, and I don't know anything about you. So I guess it's not as bad of a con as the others. But yeah, that's also something I'm still getting used to.
Right. So that sounds just like life in the public eye a little bit. I mean, maybe it's not like everybody in the whole world knows, but there's definitely a subsection within the Catholic world that does know you well, or knows your story well. They don't know you well.
Exactly.
But please tell us, are you still happy you did it? Are you still glad that you shared it? And if yes, why are you still happy about that?
So I absolutely am happy that I shared it. And the biggest reason for that is that I know that this is something that God asked me to do. And I did it in response to that, to his word, to his, his request. I did it for him. And knowing that gives me this conviction to just kind of deal with all of the, all of the cons, the rejection, the awkwardness, the uncomfortable situations and feelings. It's so hard to deal with all of that if you don't know that God has put you in this place.
Yeah, I think that's the best reason to do anything that we do, and especially things like that. And maybe the reason why we're doing this podcast. We're not influencers, or we don't want to just be somebody who is known. But if God puts something on your heart and you really feel strongly convicted after praying, after discerning that this is what He wants you to do, then yeah, just do it. Like, but okay, I've got to ask you, like, did you pray about it? Like, how did you know God wanted you to do it?
So I actually did. I waited for a year.
Wow.
Because, yeah, so this is super unlike me, guys. If you know me, I am very, very impulsive. If I think about something, I immediately implement it. I'm trying to get better at this. I don't think that my impulsiveness is a very good part of me. But yeah, like it's in my nature to be very impulsive. I remember some years ago, I was sitting and I was praying, and I felt God tell me, I guess it was an idea or a thought in my head, I should share my testimony publicly. This amazing thing has happened to me. I want people to know about it. And immediately, like, I messaged my friends. I was like, oh, guess what? I'm going to go public with my story. Susanna, you were one of those people. And do you remember you said?
I do remember you saying that to me. And even though I am like fully on board with your story, I think stories like that need to be shared. From my experience in the Catholic world, I felt that I should sort of give you a word of caution and say, hey, like, slow it down, this might be what God's asking you to do, but like, just take some time, because things will change. The way that people talk about you, the way that people see you it's going to affect you. Take some time to really be sure that this is what God wants you to do. And you did that.
Yeah, so that's what you said, and that's what a lot of people said. I'm so grateful that, you guys, my friends, advised me to take time to wait, to pray, and to really, really seek God before making this big decision. I'm so glad that you told me to do that, because I did it. I waited, I prayed. It took almost a year of waiting and praying for the right time before I finally decided that now is the time to share my testimony publicly. I'm so glad I took that time, because when I finally shared my testimony, I was in a good place to weather all of the things that were coming at me really fast. And I don't think I would have been able to do that, if I had shared that, the moment that I had the thought.
Yeah, that's really good, because I feel like I've often heard this piece of wisdom in Catholic circles, is that we shouldn't be sharing publicly or being on a platform too soon after a conversion. And there's a temptation, right, to both for the person themselves to share and maybe for other people to say like, hey, look at this guy, like, look at their conversion story, isn't it cool? But there's wisdom in waiting and just living the life of a Christian and disciple before getting on a platform and sharing it. And, I guess you saw the fruits of that, which is that spiritual maturity, which, is obviously an ongoing process, but enough that you were able to deal with the negative consequences of sharing publicly.
So not to make everything about St. Paul.
Well, we must make everything about St. Paul. Let's do it.
So St. Paul, he himself spent, I think, about 3 years in Arabia. He calls it his time in Arabia. After his conversion, really learning and deepening his faith. St. Paul, he was not a contemporary of Jesus, so he was not there when Jesus was, giving his teachings and doing his miracles. And so Paul he had to learn about Jesus. Who is he really? What can we know about him? What did he say? And Paul needed that time. He took that time. He took 3 years. I remember after my conversion, a friend told me, St. Paul spent 3 years in Arabia. And I was like, I do not want to spend 3 years in Arabia. I want to go out right now and become a missionary for Jesus. And God forced me into that, into the desert, into Arabia, into that time of growth and spiritual maturity. And I'm so glad that he did. But yeah, if St. Paul is not above waiting and growing and deepening his faith, then neither should we be.
That is so good. I'm so glad you waited. And I see a lot of the way that you share your testimony. I see a lot of spiritual maturity and holy balance in the way that you share it. So that's probably the fruit of waiting as well, and allowing the Lord to guide the whole process. So Krysanne, back to the pros. You shared so vulnerably with your family, and you said it was super awkward. But were there any pros to sharing all this with them?
So it was definitely awkward. But I think that, sharing my story with them, it introduced this, like I said earlier, this vulnerability into our relationship that never existed before. And I think that once I was honest with them about what I was going through during those years, my behavior, the life that I was leading that was away from God, that sinful lifestyle, it introduced a lot of hurt into our relationship. Like, there was a lot of deception, a lot of lies that I had to say when I was living that lifestyle. I had to hide a lot of things from my family. And I guess there was just a lot of hurt that had accumulated over the years. And I guess once I shared my testimony with them, so one thing is that, I had the opportunity to ask them for forgiveness. The second thing is that they got to see me with a lot more compassion, and they got to understand what I was going through during that time, which I had never shared with them. That turmoil, that wrestling, that difficulty, that depression, everything that I was going through during that time, they became aware of it, and it helped them to see me also with compassion and to understand what I was going through, which I guess helped them to forgive me.
That's so beautiful. That's such a gift to vulnerability, right? Like there's a danger, but it's also can be something so beautiful and good for relationships. So any other pros, Krysanne, to sharing your testimony so publicly?
So there are a couple. And the first thing is that I've had a lot of people message me after I shared my testimony and say that they relate, that they resonate with where I'm coming from, and that my testimony really impacted them. I had these virtual strangers literally tell me their life story, tell me the deepest places in their heart where they have felt hurt or where they've received healing. And I just feel so honored that I get to hear these stories, and that what God has done for me is touching people and kind of introducing them to what God can do for them. And that is I will weather any number of hate comments, any number of broken friendships, just to know that there are people who are being introduced to this loving and merciful God through my story. And similar to that is that on account of being one of the few voices in the Indian Catholic space who has the story, who shares the story, I feel like I have been able to add to this conversation about this whole LGBT topic with regards to our faith. And I guess before this, a lot of people were talking about this topic. There were really good groups that were talking about this topic in a very well-intentioned way. But it's really hard to talk about this topic when you don't have any personal experience, because it comes across as preaching. No matter how well-intentioned you are, people think that you just don't know what you're talking about. And, once I started sharing my testimony, and I've been invited a few different places to share my testimony, I feel like it lends credibility to the truth, because they get to see a person who's really lived through that and who can really attest that, that there is truth and beauty in accepting the teachings of the Catholic Church.
I see one of the best gifts of you sharing openly is that you're taking away the shame associated with this particular struggle. And I know there are some people who think shame is good, but I don't think shame is good, because I feel like it stops you from being able to receive God's mercy. It keeps you trapped. I feel like it's the devil's tactic to just make you feel so horrible about yourself that you just don't think you can ever be different. And so when you start speaking about it, it's like taking away the shame and moving out of the darkness and into the light. And I feel like people who might have the same struggles as you could look at themselves and say, first of all, I'm not a bad person for having these struggles. I'm just someone with these particular struggles. And there are other people like me. And God still loves me. And I can still live a beautiful, holy, wonderful Catholic life. And I can be a missionary, and I can share the love of Christ with others, just like Krysanne. It's beautiful. I think that's something that unless you see it, you don't know that it's true. I remember somebody saying hey, we're waiting to hear about the first LGBT saints, and obviously there must be already saints who have had these struggles. We haven't heard about it yet. But how beautiful if we can hear that and see that, because then we know it's possible for those who have the same struggles.
I would love that.
So thank you, Krysanne, so much once again for sharing your story. This is the vulnerability about the vulnerable story. But I think this could be really beautiful and helpful to other people too. Guys, in our next episode, we're going to be talking more about this, not so much about Krysanne's personal story, but more about how we as Catholics can reach out to those who have LGBT struggles and who are in that place and in that world, and what works and what doesn't. So tune in for our next episode. And meanwhile, don't forget to like our Instagram page, Saints These Days.